Gideon Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He rode into the Hartley yard on a Tuesday morning with 6 men behind him and a document in his hand that he hadn't bothered to have properly signed. And when Clara Hartley opened her door with flowers still on her apron and her infant asleep in the back room, he looked at her the way a man looks at furniture he's decided to move. "You have 30 days, he said, holding out the paper. She took it. Her hands were shaking. The document claimed her husband owed Voss $4,000, a debt that had never existed, written in ink that was barely dry. When she looked up to protest, Voss had already turned his horse around. He didn't wait for her answer. Men like Gideon Voss never did. If you were Clara Hartley, standing in that doorway with 2 sleeping babies and a lie in your hands, what would you do? If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel tells stories about ordinary people pushed to the edge of everything, and what happens when they refuse to break. If these stories move you, subscribe and follow along. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. The barn door didn't just open. It exploded inward. Mara Bellamy was already awake. When it happened, she'd been awake for most of the night, listening to the blizzard tear at the walls of her house the way something alive tears at a wound. 3 days of it now. 3 days of wind that sounded like screaming and snow that came down so thick and fast it swallowed the fence posts whole and turned the yard into something that no longer looked like her yard at all. She had learned in the 6 years since she'd been alone on this land not to sleep too deeply when the weather turned violent. The ranch required a woman who was paying attention. So when the barn door slammed open just past midnight, she heard it. She was out of bed before the echo died, her feet hitting the cold floorboards, her hand closing around the rifle she kept propped against the nightstand. Not because she was fearful fear was a luxury. She'd stopped allowing herself sometime around her 34th birthday, but because in Wyoming territory, in the winter of 1878, an open barn door in the middle of a blizzard meant something had gone wrong, and something going wrong at midnight had a way of getting worse if you waited to find out what it was. She pulled on her boots without sitting down, an old habit. She wrapped her coat around her shoulders as she moved through the dark house, not bothering with a lamp. She knew the layout of her own home the way she knew the layout of her own hands. She'd built half of it herself. The cold hit her the moment she opened the back door. It was the kind of cold that didn't feel like weather. It felt like punishment, like the land itself had decided to make a point. The snow was still coming down in sheets, near horizontal in the wind, and she had to tuck her chin to her chest and lean into it just to cross the yard. The barn was 30 feet away. It took her almost a minute. She pushed through the gap in the door sideways, keeping the rifle up. The horses were awake and restless, could hear them stamping, could feel their unease in the air before her eyes adjusted enough to make sense of what she was seeing. Her lantern was on the hook just inside the door. She lit it with one hand, keeping the rifle in the other, and the light swung out across the hay-covered floor. There was a man collapsed against the far wall. He was big, broad-shouldered, dressed in a coat so caked with ice and snow that it was hard to tell where the man ended and the storm began. He was on his side, and at first Mara thought he was dead. Then she saw his arms. They were curled tight against his chest, locked in a shape that didn't quite make sense, and she stepped closer, and the lantern light caught what he was holding, and her breath stopped entirely. 2 infants, small enough that they were nearly hidden inside the man's coat, tucked against his body like he'd wrapped himself around them deliberately, using his own heat as a shield. They were so still that for one terrible second, Mara wasn't sure they were breathing at all. She moved fast. She crossed the barn in 6 steps and dropped to one knee beside them, and the moment she reached out toward the babies, the man's eyes snapped open. They were dark eyes, and they were not confused. "Don't." His voice was barely a sound, cracked and raw, coming from somewhere deep in a damaged chest. "They'll kill you too." Mara did not pull her hand back. "Who will?" she said. He didn't answer. His eyes stayed open for another 3 seconds, and then they closed again. And his breathing went shallow in a way that told her she had maybe an hour before. The question of who had killed her became a lot less pressing than the question of whether this man would survive the night. Stood up and went to wake Ephraim. Ephraim Cole had been her ranch hand for 4 years, which meant he had been woken up in the middle of the night for various emergencies. enough times that he no longer made a sound of protest when it happened. He was at the barn door in under 3 minutes, his coat half-buttoned, his white hair sticking up on one side, his expression the careful blankness of a man who had learned to assess a situation before he reacted to it. He took one look at the man on the floor and the 2 infants and said, "Hell." "That's what I said," Mara told him. "He alive?" "Barely." "Help me get him inside." Ephraim was 61 years old and had a bad knee from a fall off a roof in his 50s, but he was still strong enough to take most of the stranger's weight when Mara couldn't manage it alone. Got him up between them, each taking an arm across their shoulders, and Mara carried both babies against her chest, with her free hand pressed flat against their backs to feel if they were breathing. They were. Small, shallow breaths, but there. Getting back to the house was ugly. The man kept losing consciousness between steps, which meant he kept losing coordination, which meant there were several moments where all 3 of them nearly went down in the yard. The snow was deep enough that every step required effort. By the time they got him through the back door and onto the kitchen floor, Mara was breathing hard in a way she didn't like, and Ephraim's face had gone a color that concerned her. "Sit down before you fall down," she told him. "I'm fine." "Sit down, Ephraim." He sat. She laid the babies on the kitchen table gently, side by side, and held the lantern close to look at them. Girls, she thought, both of them, by the little she could see of their faces. Young enough that they shouldn't have been anywhere near a blizzard. Couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 months old. Someone had wrapped them in layers of cloth, good cloth, like whoever had done it had known what they were doing and had spent some time thinking about it. They were cold, but not dangerously so. The man's body heat had been enough. Barely. She wrapped them in blankets from the bedroom chest and put them in the wooden crate she used for laundry, setting it near enough to the stove that the warmth would reach them. And then she turned to the man on her kitchen floor. The wound was in his side, just above his hip. She found it when she got his coat and shirt off a gunshot, and not a fresh one. 3, maybe 4 days old, which meant it had been festering in the cold. And the wet for 3 or 4 days, and the smell of it made her jaw tighten. She'd seen infected wounds before. She knew what they meant. "Get me the box under my bed," she told Ephraim. The wooden one with the latch. He didn't ask questions. He was back in 2 minutes with the box, and Mara opened it on the floor beside the man and started working. It was not elegant work. The man regained consciousness twice during it, and both times he gasped and went rigid. And both times Mara spoke to him in a flat, practical voice that wasn't meant to be comforting so much as orienting. "You're inside. You're not dying yet. Stay still." Both times he managed to stay still. She gave him a strip of leather to bite down on when she cleaned the wound, and he used it. And he didn't make the kind of sounds that would have embarrassed him later. She respected that. By the time she was done, the stove had warmed the kitchen enough that she could feel her toes again, and the babies were making small sounds in their crate, not crying, just the low, murmuring sounds of infants, reassuring themselves that the world was still present. Mara stood up from the floor and washed her hands in the basin and looked at Ephraim, who was watching her with the expression he got when he wanted to say something and was calculating the odds of it being welcomed. "Go ahead," she said. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you know who this man is?" "No." "You know who those children are?" "No. But you're keeping them." It wasn't really a question. Mara dried her hands on the cloth by the basin and looked at the man on her kitchen floor. He was breathing steadily now, which was more than she'd expected 2 hours ago. His face, cleaned of the ice and grime, was somewhere in its late 30s, a hard face, not unkind, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent years doing things he didn't talk about. "I'm not putting them back in the barn," she said. Ephraim nodded once. He pulled his coat tighter and looked at the babies in the crate. "Then I'll keep watch." The man's name was Elias Rourke. He told her that the next morning, when the fever had broken enough for him to string sentences together, and he told her with the particular care of someone who understood that a name was information that could be used against him. He was sitting up against the kitchen wall, his color still bad, but his eyes clear, and he looked at Mara across the room, the way a man looks at someone he's trying to take the measure of quickly. She understood that kind of looking. She'd done it herself, often enough. "The girls," he said first. Not hello or thank you or any of the things a person said when they woke up alive in a stranger's house. "Just the girls. Sleeping," Mara said. "They're fine. I fed them this morning." Something moved across his face, relief so profound it briefly made him look like a different man. Then it went away, and the careful face came back. How long was I out since last night? It's near noon now. He absorbed that. He looked at the window, which showed nothing but white. The blizzard was still going. You need to stay where you are, Mara said. That wound was infected. You're not dying today, but you could be dying tomorrow if you tear it open. He looked at her steadily. You're the one who… Yes. Thank you. I haven't decided if you deserve it yet. She sat down across from him with her cup of coffee and looked at him directly. Tell me about the children. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, their names are June and May. Their father was a man named Thomas Hartley. Their mother was Clara. He stopped. The way he said was left no room for misunderstanding. Mara set her cup down. How long ago? 8 days. She waited. There's a man, Elias said. His voice had gone very flat, which she recognized as the tone people used when they were describing something they couldn't afford to feel all the way through. Gideon Voss. He runs cattle in the Powder River country. Owns half the county, or he thinks he does. Thomas Hartley had land that Voss wanted, land with a silver deposit under it, and water rights worth more than the silver. Thomas wouldn't sell. He paused. Thomas is dead. Clara is dead. The girls have no one except you. Thomas was my friend. He said it simply, like it was the only explanation needed. Maybe it was. And Voss, he wants the girls dead too? Voss wants the land. The girls are the legal heirs. As long as they're alive, the land can't be taken clean. He looked at her. I was carrying them to Copper Springs. There's a territorial judge there, and an attorney who knew Thomas knew him well enough to have documents that could prove what Voss did. I had the children on the trail when Voss's men caught up with me. I got away from them, but I took a bullet doing it. And you ended up in my barn, and I ended up in your barn. Mara looked at him for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing something ugly to the corner of the house, a low, sustained moan that she'd stopped hearing 3 days ago. What did Voss's men look like? Something shifted in Elias's expression. He didn't look surprised by the question. He looked like he'd been waiting for her to ask it. Riders. 8 of them when I last counted. Well armed. They'd have tracked me to the edge of your property before the storm buried the trail. Which means when the storm breaks, they'll come here. He met her eyes. You should go. Take the girls and go somewhere they won't think to look. You can what? Ride out on a torn-up side with a fever that might come back? She picked up her coffee again. I appreciate the thought. I'm serious. So am I. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. You said they'll kill you too last night. When I first found you. She watched his face. That's what you said, too. Like you knew exactly who I was in relation to whatever this is. Elias was quiet, so tell me the rest, Mara said. The part you're leaving out because you think it'll make me put you back in the barn. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I know who Voss is because I used to work for men like him. Not Voss specifically, but the same kind. He watched her face carefully, looking for the thing that would change there. I was with the Blackridge gang. Started when I was 16. Stayed until I was 22. The kitchen was very quiet except for the wind and the small sounds of the sleeping babies. What made you leave? Mara asked. He seemed to have expected something different, a flinch, a demand, anger. Question caught him off guard in a way that made him briefly look younger. A family, he said. They had a farm. The gang wanted their horses and whatever money they had, and there were orders to leave no witnesses. He stopped. I didn't follow the orders. And the family? Survived. And you? Ran. He said it with self-pity, just fact. I've been running for 15 years. I'm good at it. A pause. I was good at it. Mara stood up and went to the window and looked out at the white nothing beyond the glass. She thought about running. She knew what it cost. She'd done her own version of it. Years ago, in circumstances she didn't discuss with anyone, not with Ephraim, not with anyone. She'd run, and she'd found this land, and she'd made it hers through sheer stubborn refusal to be moved again. And there were days when the price of that stubbornness had felt like more than she could afford. She turned back from the window. When the storm breaks, she said, how many men do you think will come? Elias looked at her carefully. At least 12. She nodded slowly, like she was doing math in her head. Ephraim, she called, without raising her voice much. Ephraim, a short, ugly laugh. Ephraim appeared in the doorway to the next room with the particular promptness of a man who had already been listening. Get the ammunition box from the cellar, Mara said. Both of them. Ephraim looked at Elias. Then he looked at Mara. Then he went to get the ammunition boxes. Elias watched all of this with an expression that was hard to read. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "I'm afraid," Mara said. She sat back down across from him and picked up her coffee, which had gone cold. "I'm afraid every day. I've just had enough practice that it doesn't move me anymore." She looked at him levelly. "Those girls aren't dying on my land. You're going to have to tell me everything now. Everything about Voss. Everything about Blackridge. Everything about where we're going and what it'll take to get there. Because when the storm breaks, we're going to need a plan." Elias Rourke looked at the woman across from him, at the steadiness in her and the damage underneath it, both of which he recognized because he'd seen that combination before in men who'd survived things that should have killed them. And for the first time in 8 days, he felt something that wasn't urgency or fear or grief. He felt faintly and unexpectedly like he might not have to do this alone. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you everything." Outside, the blizzard pressed against the house on all sides, and somewhere in the white distance, 12 riders were waiting for it to end. The storm broke on the 4th morning. Mara knew it before she opened her eyes, not because the wind had stopped, but because the quality of the silence that replaced it was different. The blizzard had been a living thing, pressing and moaning against the house for 3 days, and when it finally exhausted itself, sometime before dawn, what it left behind was the particular stillness of a world that had been reshaped overnight and hadn't yet decided what it was going to be. She was up and dressed before the light came fully through the windows. She'd slept in the kitchen chair for the 2nd night running, her rifle across her knees, and her back was telling her about it in specific and unpleasant terms. She ignored it. She'd been ignoring her body's complaints for long enough that she and it had reached a kind of grudging arrangement. It would keep functioning, and she would keep not listening to it. Elias was awake when she stood. He'd been given the cot they'd dragged in from Ephraim's room, and he was sitting up on it now, watching the window with the stillness of a man who had learned to read weather the way other men read newspapers. "They'll move at first light," he said. He didn't say good morning. Neither did she. "How much time do we have?" "An hour. Maybe less, if they were camped close." Mara crossed to the window and looked out. The yard was transformed. The fence posts had disappeared entirely. The snow drifted up to the bottom of the barn door, the world a flat white expanse that caught the early gray light and threw it back hard. Beautiful, in the way that things that could kill you were sometimes beautiful. She'd lived in Wyoming long enough to know the difference between appreciating that and being fooled by it. "Ephraim," she said. He was already in the doorway. He'd been up longer than either of them, she suspected. "Horses are fed. Rifles are loaded. I put the extra ammunition in the saddlebags like you asked." She nodded. She looked at Elias. "Can you?" "Yes. That's not what I asked. Can you ride hard if you have to?" He paused for just a beat, which was honest enough that she respected it. "For a while. Then we'll work with that." She moved to the table where she'd laid out the map the night before, a rough thing, hand-drawn, that she'd made herself over 6 years of learning the land around the ranch. She pointed without touching it. "There's a ridge trail that cuts north before it bends toward Copper Springs. Most people don't know it because it's not on any surveyor's map. I found it by accident in my 2nd winter here. It's narrow and it'll be rough with the snow, but it cuts 8 miles off the main road. And if they know the country well enough to know the ridge trail, then we deal with that when it happens." She folded the map and put it in her coat. "We're not going to outplan every possibility. We're going to move and adjust." Elias looked at her in that way. He had not doubting. Exactly, but measuring, trying to find the edges of her. "You've done this before. Not this specifically, but something like it." She didn't answer that. She went to the crate where June and May were sleeping and stood over them for a moment. They'd been better since yesterday, more alert, eating well, starting to make the sounds that infants made when they felt safe. June had a habit of clenching her fists even in sleep, her small face serious and intent. May slept with her mouth slightly open and her arms flung wide, like she was trying to take up as much space as possible. Mara had not let herself think too carefully about how much she'd come to know those two faces in 3 days. That kind of thinking was not useful right now. She lifted them both carefully and began the business of getting them wrapped and ready for cold travel. They were out of the house and moving 20 minutes later. Mara had the babies bundled against her chest inside her coat, a carrying arrangement she'd rigged from 2 lengths of cloth the night before, that left her hands free for the reins. It was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. Ephraim rode to her left and slightly behind, and Elias rode to her right, with his jaw set against pain he wasn't complaining about. And the 3 horses pushed through the drifted snow in the yard and out through the gate and onto the open land. Cold was extraordinary, the kind that got inside a breath and stayed there. They made it 300 yards before Ephraim said, quietly, "Riders. Behind us, coming out of the trees on the east side." Mara didn't turn around. "How many? Can't tell yet." "More than 4. Keep moving. Mara, keep moving, Ephraim. Same pace. Don't run yet." She could feel Elias looking at her from the right. She could also feel, in some awareness she couldn't have named, the weight of the rider behind them, the way the air felt different when people with bad intentions were moving through it. She'd learned that feeling a long time ago, in a different life, in circumstances she kept locked in a room in her memory that she did not open. They reached the ridge trail, entrance a gap in the tree line that looked like nothing, just a break between 2 stands of pine, and Mara turned her horse into it without hesitating, and the other 2 followed. Behind them she heard shouting. "Now," she said, and all 3 of them pushed their horses into the fastest the trail would allow. The ridge trail was not made for speed. It was narrow and uneven and threaded between rock faces and tree roots, and in the summer it was merely inconvenient. And in the winter it was genuinely dangerous. And right now it was covered in 1.5 feet of snow that hid everything underneath it. Mara's horse stumbled twice in the first quarter mile. The second time, it nearly went down, and she felt the babies lurch against her chest and pressed her arm across them and held on with her knees until the horse recovered. And then she kept going. The riders behind them hit the trail entrance and slowed. She could hear them. The shouting had organized itself into something more purposeful, and there were at least 6 of them, maybe 8, and they were coming. But the trail was single-file country, which meant their numbers didn't help them. Ephraim glanced back and called, 2 of them breaking east, going around. "Trying to cut us off at the ridge top," Elias said. His voice was tight with something, but his hands on the reins were steady. "There's a crossing point up there if they know this trail." "They don't know this trail," Mara said. "You sure?" "No." She pushed her horse harder. "Keep moving." The trail climbed. Horses labored. June made a small sound against Mara's chest, not crying, just a complaint, the sound of a baby who did not appreciate being jostled, and Mara pressed her palm flat against the cloth wrapping and felt the answering warmth of the small body underneath it. "I know," she thought, though she didn't say it. "I know." Almost through. They broke out onto the ridge top in a spray of snow, and the 2 riders who'd gone around were already there. They were positioned at the far end of the ridge, blocking the path down. Both had rifles drawn. One of them, big man, dark coat, sitting his horse with the ease of someone who'd spent most of his life. On one held up a hand like he was directing traffic. "Nobody needs to die today," he called out. "Mr. Voss just wants the children returned. You hand them over and ride away. And that's the end of it." Mara stopped her horse. Ephraim and Elias came up on either side of her. The 3 of them looked at the 2 men walking the path, and the 2 men looked back. And for a moment, nothing happened except the wind moving across the ridgetop and carrying everyone's breath away in white clouds. "Those are interesting terms," Mara said. Her voice came out level, which was the only thing she was currently proud of. "What does Voss do with them after?" "That's not your concern, ma'am." "It is, actually." The big man's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite patience anymore. "We've got 6 more men on your back trail. You've got nowhere to go. Make the smart choice." Mara looked at the man. Then she looked at Elias, who had gone very still in the way she'd noticed he went still when he was calculating something. "The one on the left," Elias said quietly. "Almost no volume at all. I see him. He's not going to wait much longer." "I know." What happened next happened in approximately 4 seconds, and none of it went the way it probably would have if any of the people involved had been given time to think about it properly. Elias moved first, not toward the 2 men but away from them, pulling his horse sharply right, and drawing their attention and their rifle muzzles with him, and in the moment that both men tracked the movement, Mara pulled her own rifle from its scabbard one-handed and fired once. She hit the left man's horse in the shoulder. She'd aimed for the man's arm and missed, which would bother her later, and the animal screamed and reared and threw its rider into the snow, and in the chaos that followed, Ephraim rode straight at the second man and hit him with his horse's shoulder at enough speed to unseat him. It was not elegant, Both men went down. Neither was dead. The 6 men on the back trail were going to be on the ridge in under 2 minutes. Move, Mara said, and they moved. They rode hard for 40 minutes without speaking, pushing through country that got rougher and then slowly, grudgingly, easier. The back trail went quiet behind them, whether because the pursuit had lost them or was regrouping, she couldn't tell. She didn't stop to find out. When they finally pulled up in a stand of timber thick enough to give cover on all sides, all 3 horses were blowing hard, and Elias had gone a gray color that she didn't like. He let out a short, ugly laugh. He was holding the reins correctly and his back was straight, but there was sweat on his face that had nothing to do with the cold, and he was breathing with a shallowness that told her to. The wound was speaking loudly. Get down, she told him. I'm all right, Elias. Get down. He got down. Cost him something he didn't let show in his face, which she noticed, and he stood with one hand against his horse's flank and breathed for a moment while she checked the babies, both awake now, both looking at her with the wide, uncertain expressions of infants who have been through more than they have language for. They're all right, Ephraim said, looking over her shoulder. He'd been watching her assess them. His own voice had the particular roughness of a man who was holding himself together by practice rather than ease. He was 61 years old, and he'd just ridden a ridge fight, and she was not going to acknowledge what that had cost him, unless he brought it up, because that was what he would want. Elias lowered himself carefully against a tree trunk and sat there. His hand went briefly to his side and came away without blood showing through the coat, which was something. He looked at Mara with an expression she couldn't fully read. You shot that man's horse, he said. I was aiming for his arm. I know. You still pulled the shot when you could have taken him out of the saddle permanently. Killing a man in front of 2 infants wasn't my first choice. He was quiet for a moment. That was the second time you made a choice like that. In the barn, you could have left us. I could have, she agreed. Why didn't you? She looked at him. She thought about several different answers and discarded all of them because they weren't quite true. What was true was more complicated and less flattering. The truth involved a woman who had lived alone for 6 years and had learned to keep her world very small and very controlled, and who had seen 2 infants and a dying man and felt something crack open in the careful architecture of that control, and who had made the choices that followed not from nobility, but from someplace older and harder to name. She wasn't sure she owed him that explanation yet. It was midnight, and they were babies, she said finally. I'm not the kind of person who can do nothing about a baby. It wasn't the whole truth. It was enough. They made camp in the timber for an hour, long enough for Elias to rest, for Mara to check the wound and find it holding, for Ephraim to scout back along their trail and return shaking his head to indicate no immediate pursuit. Then they moved again, slower now, conserving the horses. It was during the second hour of riding, on a stretch of flat open country where the wind had scoured the snow thin enough to make decent time, that Elias said, You're going to want to know about the scar. Mara glanced at him. I noticed it. She had noticed it the night she'd worked on his wound, a brand, old and deliberate, on the inside of his left forearm. A shape she didn't recognize, but that had the look of something made with intent. It's the black ridge mark, he said. All the members got it. Can't get rid of it. I tried once, and it left a worse scar over it, so I stopped. He paused. When we get to Copper Springs and when people see it, they're going to know what I was. The mark is known in this territory. Is that why you're telling me now? So I can decide whether to be seen with you? It's your choice to make. She rode for a while without answering. Then she said, Tell me how you got into the gang. He told her. He told it without decoration, without self-pity, without the practiced narrative shape of a story that had been told for sympathy before. He'd been 16. His family, his mother, his younger brother had been killed during a raid on their homestead by men working for a land speculator, the same kind of quiet, legal-looking violence that Voss had used on Thomas Hartley. Elias had survived because he'd been in the field. He'd buried them alone, and then walked for 3 days to the nearest town, and found the only people who seemed willing to do something about men like the ones who'd done it. The Black Ridge Gang had not been interested in justice. He hadn't known that yet at 16. By the time he understood what they actually were, he was in too deep to walk away cleanly. So you stayed 6 years, Mara said. I stayed 6 years. And the family that finally made you leave. Farmers. They had 3 kids. The order was to take everything and burn the house, and leave nothing that could file a complaint later. He stopped. His voice had gone flat, in the specific way it went flat when he was containing something large. I got the family out the back of the house while the others were coming in the front. I told them to run toward the Henderson Road and not stop. Then I set fire to the barn myself to give everyone something else to look at, and I ran the opposite direction. And the gang came after you. The gang came after me. I had a 6-hour head start and a good horse and 15 years of practice, and I've been ahead of them since. Most of them. He looked out at the horizon. Silas Crow hasn't stopped. He never stops. Who is Silas Crow? The name did something to Elias's face that she hadn't seen before, not fear exactly. Something harder and older than fear. He was my partner in the gang. We came up together. He's the one who first brought me in, when I was 16 and had nothing and nowhere to go. He paused. He's also the best tracker I've ever known, and he takes betrayal, personally, and he's been behind me on and off for 15 years. And I know his methods well enough to know that Voss finding me on that trail was not a coincidence. Quiet that followed had some weight to it. Crow is working for Voss, Mara said. I think Voss hired him specifically. Crow would know where I'd go, how I'd move, what I'd do. He glanced at her. He'll know about the ridge trail if he's been watching me long enough. He'll know the kinds of choices I make, but he doesn't know mine. Elias looked at her. No, he said slowly, he doesn't know yours. She stored that information away and kept riding. They reached the outskirts of Ridgemont by late afternoon, when the light had gone the particular pale orange of a winter sun giving up for the day. Ridgemont was not Copper Springs. It was smaller, quieter, the kind of town that had been built to serve the mining operations and had stayed after the mines went thin, sustained by stubbornness and a lack of better options. Mara had been here twice before and knew it well enough to know that it had a general store, a livery, a saloon, and an attorney's office above the hardware establishment on the main street. The attorney's office was what they needed. Abraham Whitlock had been Thomas Hartley's lawyer. Elias knew the name. Thomas had mentioned it, and in the days before the murders, Thomas had sent Whitlock documents for safekeeping. Documents that, if they existed and could be found, would lay out the entirety of Voss's scheme, with enough specificity to hang him. Legally speaking, anyway. Whitlock may not be in town, Ephraim pointed out, as they rode down the edge of the main street trying not to attract attention, which was only partially successful, given that there were 2 infants visible in Mara's coat wrapping. He's in town, Elias said. Thomas told me Whitlock hadn't left Ridgemont in 4 years. He's afraid to. Afraid of what? Elias didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was careful. Thomas said Whitlock knew things about Voss that made him too valuable to kill and too dangerous to let roam freely. Voss has been persuasive about keeping him close. Mara understood this without needing it elaborated. She'd known men like Voss in her life before this ranch, and she understood the particular strategy of keeping useful people scared and local. It was efficient, in a vicious sort of way. They stabled the horses at the livery, paying the boy there twice what he asked, and telling him they'd never been, and Mara handed babies to Ephraim with instructions to find somewhere warm and inconspicuous and stay there, which Ephraim accepted with the equanimity of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by what he was asked to do. Then she and Elias went to find Abraham Whitlock. The office above the hardware store was accessed by an exterior staircase on the building's east side, and door at the top was locked, and there was no light visible through the frosted window beside it. Elias knocked twice. Nothing. He knocked again. Differently 3 short, a pause, 2 more, and Mara raised an eyebrow at him. Thomas told me, he said quietly, in case I ever needed to find Whitlock on short notice. A long pause. Then footsteps, cautious and slow, crossing a floor. The sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened 4 inches, held by a chain, and a face appeared in the gap, a man in his 50s, thin, with spectacles, and the complexion of someone who hadn't been outside in several months. His eyes went to Elias, then to Mara, then back to Elias. No, he said, and started to push the door closed. Elias put his boot in the gap. Thomas Hartley sent me. Thomas Hartley is dead. I know that. I was there. His voice was quiet and direct. His daughters are in this town right now, alive, and Gideon Voss has 12 men looking for them. We need what Thomas sent you tonight. Another long pause. Eyes behind the spectacles were calculating something, running numbers that didn't make themselves visible. Then the door closed, the chain scraped, and it opened again all the way. They went inside. Abraham Whitlock's office was the office of a man who was afraid not because it was messy or neglected, but because of the specific ways it was organized. There were 2 locks on the door. The window shades were drawn to the sills. There was a second door at the back of the room that Mara marked automatically. There was a bottle of whiskey on the desk with about a quarter left in it, and it was 2 in the afternoon. He sat behind the desk and looked at them, and he looked worst at Elias, at the coat sleeve pushed up where Elias had instinctively pushed it back, before knocking, revealing the edge of the black ridge scar. "I know what that mark means," Whitlock said. "Most people do," Elias said. "Thomas vouched for you?" "Thomas was my friend for 11 years. We met when I was 23, and he was 20. And for 11 years he was one of 4 people on Earth who knew what I'd been, and didn't let it determine what I was." His voice stayed even. "Those are his daughters that I carried through a 3-day blizzard with a bullet in my side. You can make whatever judgment you want about me. Just do it after you give us what Thomas sent you." Whitlock looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara. "And you? What's your stake in this?" "They were in my barn," she said. He seemed to find this answer either confusing or insufficient. He turned back to Elias. "Voss knows you're alive. His men came here 3 days ago, asking questions." He paused. "They asked about Whitlock's files specifically. I told them I had nothing of Thomas's, that Thomas had moved his accounts tied to Cheyenne the year before. They appeared to believe it. Did they search the office?" "They searched the public rooms, yes. They didn't find the safe." Mara's attention sharpened. "There's a safe." Whitlock stood up slowly and went to the far wall, where a large map of the territory hung on wooden pegs. He took the map down to reveal a panel of plain wood that looked, on close inspection, slightly newer than the surrounding boards. He pressed 2 points simultaneously, and the panel swung out, and behind it was a small iron set into the wall itself. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the safe's door and his back to them, and Mara could see the particular tension in his shoulders of a man deciding something. "Whitlock," Elias said. "He has my sister," Whitlock said. His voice had changed, gone thinner, more exposed. "In Laramie. She doesn't know she's being watched, but I know. Voss told me 6 months ago. He told me in a very pleasant voice over a very ordinary dinner, and then he talked about something else, and that was how the conversation ended. I've been aware ever since." He turned around. His face had the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time alone. "If I give you what's in that safe and Voss survives it, if the legal case fails, or the judge is bought, or anything goes wrong, my sister pays for it." "I know," Elias said. "Then you understand why I can't simply—" "Whitlock." Mara stepped forward. She hadn't planned to speak, but something in the man's face, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been making a hostage negotiation with themselves for months, made her unable to stay quiet. "I understand what you're describing. I understand it more than you'd think. But hear me clearly. If you give Voss what he wants by keeping those documents hidden, Thomas's daughters have no inheritance and no protection and no legal existence. Voss doesn't need to kill children if he can simply make them disappear into the system without any record of what they're owed." She held his gaze. "Surrender guarantees the deaths. It just makes them slower and harder to trace." The room was very quiet. Whitlock turned back to the safe, opened it, and began to take out the documents inside. What Thomas Hartley had sent Abraham Whitlock for safekeeping was, even to Mara's non-legal eyes, extraordinary. There were land deeds originals, not copies with signatures that predated any of Voss's claimed acquisitions by years. There were letters between Voss and 2 territorial officials that described, in language that was careful but not careful enough, the plan to create a false debt and use it to force a sale. There were financial records in the movement of money that didn't exist through accounts that shouldn't have held it. And at the bottom of the stack, in a handwriting she didn't recognize, but that Elias went very still looking at, was a signed statement from a man named Corvin Aldred, identifying himself as the man Voss had hired to arrange the Hartley killings, describing in specific detail what he'd been paid and what he'd done. "Aldred is dead," Whitlock said, watching Elias's face. "Voss had him killed 6 weeks after the statement was written. I don't know how Thomas got it from him. Thomas never told me. Thomas was resourceful," Elias said quietly. He set the statement down carefully, like it was something that could break. He always was. The grief in his voice was real and unmanaged and brief. He put it away with visible effort and looked up. "We need to move tonight," he said. "If Voss's men came here asking about these files, They may come back. And if Crow is ahead of us, there's a tunnel, Whitlock said. They both looked at him. The building was a mining company office originally. There's an access tunnel to the old shaft system. The entrance is in the cellar, below the hardware store. It runs half a mile north, before it comes up in the tree line, behind the old assay office. He was wrapping the documents in oilcloth as he spoke, his movements practiced in the way of something he'd thought about doing before, but never done. I've kept it clear, in case. In case of tonight, Mara said. In case of something like tonight, yes. He handed her the wrapped package. His hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly, and he was not going to acknowledge it, and she was not going to mention it. There's a judge in Copper Springs, Erastus Clay. He's not bought. I've checked, as carefully as I can check from here. If these documents reach him, they'll reach him, Elias said. Whitlock looked at him for a long moment, and in that look was the specific weight of a man handing over the one thing he'd been trusted to protect, and not being entirely sure he was making the right choice. Then he nodded once. The cellar door is in the back room, he said. Take the left passage, the right floods in winter. Tunnel was low and dark and cold, in a way that was different from outside. Cold, a closed, pressurized cold that had been sitting in the ground for years, unchanged. They moved through it single file. Mara, first because she had the lantern, then Elias, Ephraim at the back with the babies in the carrying cloth that Mara had transferred to him before they descended. The tunnel smelled of old earth and timber and something mineral and ageless. It was in the tunnel, in the particular isolation of underground dark, that the distance between Mara and Elias closed without either of them deciding it would. They walked close because the passage required it. Their shoulders brushed repeatedly. Once, when the floor dipped unexpectedly, and Mara caught herself on the wall, his hand came to her arm automatically steadying, certain, and stayed there for a moment, longer than steadying required, and neither of them remarked on it. She had not been touched by another person with anything approaching gentleness in a very long time. She did not know how to account for what that moment cost her to feel, so she filed it away in the room in her memory she did not open, and kept walking. At the far end, the tunnel turned upward and became a ladder, and then a trapdoor, and they emerged into the tree line behind the old assay office in the last light of the evening, with the cold hitting them all at once and the stars beginning to show in the east. Ephraim handed the babies back. May had gone to sleep against his shoulder with the specific trustfulness of an infant who has decided, for whatever baby logic reasons, that a person is safe. Mara looked at the small sleeping face and felt the cracked open place in her chest do something complicated and set it aside. Elias stood beside her and looked at the horizon, where the smear of Copper Springs lights was just visible, maybe 20 miles on. Crow will be between us and there, he said. Probably, she agreed. Mara. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it. When she looked at him, his face in the last light was serious and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. If something happens, if it goes bad between here and Copper Springs, the documents need to reach Judge Clay. Whatever else happens. I know. He stopped. Started again, more carefully. I mean that you should go, if it comes to it. Take the girls and go. And don't, I heard you the first time, she said. I'm telling you now, so you're not surprised later, that I won't do that. He looked at her. That's not rational? Probably not. She tucked the oilcloth package more securely inside her coat, against her chest, between herself and the sleeping infants. But we've come this far, and those girls have been through enough, and I don't intend to show them another person leaving. She looked at him steadily. Nobody else leaves. That's the rule now. Elias was quiet for a moment. In the distance, somewhere on the road they would have to take, a horse moved just one, or the sound of one, swallowed quickly by the wind. He heard it too. She could tell by the way his eyes moved. All right, he said. His voice was lower than usual. Nobody leaves. They walked out of the trees toward where Ephraim had brought the horses around, and the night came down around them, and 20 miles away, Copper Springs was burning. They didn't know that yet, but they were already moving toward it. They smelled the smoke before they saw it. Came on the wind from the southwest, thin at first, the kind of smell that made a person's nose work harder, trying to decide if it was real or just the particular cold night sharpness of the air, playing tricks. Then it thickened, and by the time they crested the last long hill, before the valley that held Copper Springs, the smell was no longer a question. It was a fact. The sky ahead of them had gone the color of a wound orange and deep red against the black, with a column of smoke rising from it that blotted out the stars in a wide arc to the south. Ephraim pulled up his horse and said nothing. Mara pulled up beside him and said nothing either. Elias came up on her right and looked at the horizon with an expression she could not read in the dark, and then he said, very quietly, "He got here first." "We don't know what's burning yet," Mara said. "No, but we know who set it." She didn't argue with that. She looked at the glow for a moment and did the same calculation she'd been doing since they left Ridgemont, the one that had a different answer every time she ran it because the variables kept changing. Voss had men, Voss had resources. Voss had Silas Crow, who knew Elias's patterns and had apparently managed to anticipate the route well enough to arrive in Copper Springs ahead of them. Despite the blizzard, despite the tunnel, despite every adjustment they'd made. That was not reassuring information about Crow's capabilities. "We go in quiet," she said. "No main road. There's a creek bed on the east side of town. I came through it once in the summer. It runs close to the back of the church and the livery. People are sheltering somewhere. It'll be the church." "And the judge?" Elias said. "Judge Clay has a house on the north end of town, near the mill. We find out what's burning first. Then we move." Mara Ephraim's voice was low. He was looking not at the town, but at the road below them, at the shapes that were moving on it. Riders coming up from the valley. 5, 6 of them. She looked. He was right. They were moving without lanterns, which meant they'd seen the ridge silhouettes and were coming up deliberately. Not pursuit something more organized than that. They'd been waiting at the base of the hill. "Off the road," she said, and all 3 of them moved their horses into the tree line, to the right without another word. They went still. The horses felt the stillness requested of them and obliged, as horses sometimes did when the people on their backs communicated urgency through their whole bodies rather than just their hands. June made a small sound against Mara's chest, and Mara pressed her palm flat against the bundle and held her breath. The riders came up the road at a walk, 6 of them, and they were not Voss's men, or not only Voss's men. As they passed within 30 feet, close enough that Mara could hear the creak of leather and the soft percussion of hooves on snow-packed road, she made out in the faint ambient light from the burning valley below that the man at the front was wearing a coat she recognized. She'd seen that coat in Ridgemont. It had been hanging on the hook behind Abraham Whitlock's office door. She grabbed Elias's arm. He'd already seen. His mouth was a flat line. They waited until the riders were past and their sound had faded down the other side of the hill, and then Mara said, "Shh." "He gave us up." "He may not have had a choice," Elias said. "That was his coat." "I know." She thought about the fear in Whitlock's face. The sister in Laramie, the whiskey on the desk, and the 2 looks on the door, and the 6 months of being kept in place by a threat that never had to be spoken twice. She thought about all of that, and found that she understood it and was furious about it anyway, and both things were true at the same time, and she didn't have the luxury of sitting with that right now. "He may have told them about the tunnel route," Ephraim said. "He definitely told them about the tunnel route," said. "Crow will have had men at the tree line when we came up." His voice was controlled in a way that sounded effortful. "Which means they know we have the documents." "Then the documents are the priority," Mara said. "Judge Clay gets them. The rest sorts itself out. Or it doesn't, but at least that part is done." She moved her horse back onto the road. They went down into the valley by the creek as she'd planned, threading between ice-glazed banks, with the horses picking their way carefully, and the orange light of the burning growing ahead of them. As they got closer, the source of the fire became clearer. It was not the whole town burning, which was something. 2 buildings on the south end of the main street, both of them fully involved, and the fire had the organized look of something set deliberately, rather than spreading from accident. Someone had wanted those specific buildings to burn. "That's the land office," Elias said low, "and the one next to it is where the territorial recorder kept his files." Mara absorbed this. Voss wasn't just here to take the girls, he was erasing the official record. Any documents that might have been filed locally, any registration of the Hartley land deeds, any secondary paper trail that could corroborate what was in the oilcloth package, pressed against her chest, all of it, going up in those 2 buildings. "He's covering the evidence on 2 fronts, she said. "That's what I'd do," Elias said, with the flat self-awareness of a man who knew how criminal minds worked because he'd had one once. "If I were him." The church was where she'd thought it would be, a plain clapboard building on the east side of town, away from the burning, with light in its windows. They left the horses at the back of the livery 2 buildings down and went the rest of the way on foot, moving close to, staying out of the firelit portions of the street. The church door was barred from the inside. Mara knocked in a pattern 2, pause, 3, and after a moment heard movement inside. A voice through the door. "Who is it?" She didn't recognize the voice. She glanced at Elias. "Hattie Marsh," he said quietly. At her expression, "Thomas introduced me, years ago. She ran the dressmaker's shop here. She'll know my voice." He moved closer to the door. "Hattie, it's Elias Rourke. I've got the girls." A long pause. Then 3 bolts scraped back in sequence 1, 2, 3, the sound of someone who'd had time to improve the barricade, and the door opened. There were 11 people inside the church. 3 families who'd been sheltering since the fire started, a man with a head wound who was sitting against the back wall and not entirely conscious, an elderly woman who was holding 2 babies and looking at Mara with an expression of overwhelming relief that she had clearly been managing alone for some time. "June," the old woman said, and her voice broke on it. "May." Mara looked at Elias. He was already crossing the room. "You know her?" Mara said to his back. "Eleanor Brace. She was Clara Hartley's aunt." He reached the old woman and took her hands and said something low that Mara didn't catch, and Eleanor Brace looked at him with an expression that contained grief and anger and relief in proportions that didn't quite resolve into anything simple. Mara looked around the room. The people here were frightened, but not broken farmers and townspeople who had barricaded themselves in the most solid building available and were waiting out something they hadn't been consulted about. She recognized the particular posture of people who were scared and trying not to be, who were holding things together through sheer determination not to fall apart in front of their children. A man about Ephraim's age came up beside her, solid, weathered, with a carpenter's hands and a rifle he was holding, like he knew how to use it. "You're the one Rourke mentioned," he said. It wasn't a question. I don't know what Rourke mentioned. He said he was going to find help. He said if help came through the creek side, it would be a woman with 2 babies and an old man who looked harmless but wasn't. He glanced at Ephraim, who accepted this description without offense. Said, "We should trust you." Mara looked at Elias across the room. He was still talking to Eleanor Brace and wasn't looking at her, but she understood. Suddenly, that he'd sent word ahead somehow, through the network of people who'd known Thomas, who'd known Clara, who'd known the Hartley family well enough to shelter their daughters when the storm came. He'd been building this without telling her, which was either a sign of independent competence or a sign of old habits about not sharing plans, and she was going to have words with him about it later. Right now there were more pressing matters. "What's the situation outside?" she asked the man. "Voss's men have the main street. There's maybe 16 of them. They came in late afternoon, rode through town like they owned it, which I suppose they thought they did." His jaw was tight. "They went to the land office first and said it. Then they went through the hotel looking for someone. Then they came here. Did they get in? They tried. We had time to bar the doors before they reached us. They said they'd come back, which I took to mean they had other things to do first, and we'd be tomorrow's problem. Where's Judge Clay?" The man's expression changed in a way she didn't like. "They have him. Took him out of his house this afternoon when they first came into town. He's in the hotel. I think that's where Voss set himself up." Mara looked at the oilcloth package. Then she looked at Elias. He'd heard. He was already coming back across the room. They had 20 minutes before Mara stopped the planning session, because 20 minutes was about how long she thought they had before. Voss's men made good on the promise to come back to the church. The plan that emerged from those 20 minutes was not elegant. It had too many moving parts and depended on timing that couldn't be controlled precisely, and required 2 of the men in the church, the carpenter, whose name was Dodd, and a younger man named Ferris, who'd been a mine surveyor and knew the town's layout to do things that were dangerous and not entirely their problem. Both of them agreed without much deliberation, which told Mara something about what Voss's arrival had done to this town's patience. Core of it was simple enough. Judge Clay had to be freed. The documents had to reach him. Everything else was a means to those 2 ends. "The hotel has a back entrance off the alley," Ferris said, drawing on the church floor with a piece of chalk he'd produced from his coat. "Side door leads to the kitchen. Kitchen connects to the main room, and the main room connects to the staircase. Judge Clay's room is on the 2nd floor, northwest corner. That's where Voss put him, because the window looks out over the street. and it's a long drop to nothing. How many men in the hotel? When I saw it last, 4, maybe 5 inside. The rest are on the street. Voss himself was in the main room when I passed an hour ago. Whether he's still there. Ferris spread his hands. Mara turned to Elias. You know Voss's face. I've seen him twice. Once in passing. Once when he came to Thomas's land to make the offer. His voice didn't change on that sentence, but something around his eyes did. I'll know him. Then you go for the judge. I go for Voss. Mara, not to kill him. To keep him occupied while you get Clay. She looked at him steadily. You said Crow knows how you move. He doesn't know how I move. So you take the back entrance. I take the front. Voss won't expect a woman through the front door of his own operation, which gives me maybe 30 seconds before he recalibrates. That's enough. Elias looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was complicated in ways she didn't have time to fully interpret. 30 seconds is not a large margin. No, it's not. And if Crow is in there, then we deal with Crow. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to like it. I'm telling you the plan. Something resolved in his face. Not agreement exactly, more like the decision to stop arguing with something he wasn't going to win. Ephraim stays with the girls. Ephraim stays with the girls. Dodd and Ferris hold the alley exit. She looked at the carpenter and the surveyor. You hold it. You don't come in unless you hear 3 shots. 3, not 1, not 2, Dodd nodded. Ferris nodded. She went to Ephraim, who was holding both babies with the resigned competence of a man who had held a lot of things he hadn't expected to hold over a long career. She looked at his face. He looked back at hers. If I don't come back, she started. You'll come back, he said. Ephraim, come back, he said again. And his voice had the particular quality of someone who was making a statement of fact rather than a statement of hope. And she understood that was the only way he was going to be able to let her walk out the door. She didn't push it. She pressed her hand briefly against May's sleeping head. Then she went. The main street of Copper Springs was lit by the fire that was still eating the 2 buildings to the south, throwing uneven red and orange light across everything and making shadows behave in ways that were both helpful and not. Smoke was thicker down here, low to the ground in the cold air, and Mara moved through it with her coat buttoned to the throat, and her rifle slung across her back, and her handgun in her coat pocket, where her hand was already wrapped around it. She counted 7 men on the street between the church and the hotel. They were not in formation. They were the loose, comfortable arrangement of men who didn't expect resistance, who had already decided the night was won. 2 were near the burning buildings, watching the fire with the particular vacancy, who had says of people who had set something alight and were now just waiting for it to finish. 3 were in the center of the street in a loose cluster, passing something between them. 2 more were near the hotel entrance. She walked toward the hotel entrance from a diagonal, staying close to the east side of the street, moving with the kind of deliberate ordinary pace that she'd learned a long time ago was more invisible than trying to be subtle. People who moved like they were trying not to be seen got seen. People who moved like they belonged somewhere were furniture. She made it to within 20 feet of the hotel before one of the men at the entrance looked directly at her and said, "Hold there." Stopped. He came toward her, and in the firelight she could see he was young, younger than she'd expected, with a face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to be yet. He had a rifle, and the manner of someone who'd been told he was in charge of something and was taking it seriously. "This street is closed. Voss's order." "I understand that," she said. Her voice came out conversational. "I have information for Mr. Voss directly, about the woman and the children he's looking for." Pause. He was calculating. What kind of information? Kind that's worth more than standing in the cold. She met his eyes and kept her expression one step below neutral cooperative, but not eager, because eager was suspicious. He's going to want to hear it sooner than later. "The woman left Ridgemont tonight." "We know she left Ridgemont." "Do you know where she's going?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then he stepped aside and gestured her toward the door. She went through it. The hotel's main room was warm and close, and smelled of wood smoke and tobacco and the particular stale warmth of a room with too many people in it who'd been there too long. There were 4 men inside 3 at tables. One behind the bar, who she quickly assessed, was not the barman by the way he stood. A lamp on each table, a fire going. No sign of Crow, which was either good news or the worst kind of bad news. At the far table, alone, with papers spread in front of him, and a glass of something at his elbow, sat a man she'd never seen before, but recognized immediately. Not from appearance, from posture. From the particular way he occupied space, the way powerful men did when they were in a room they considered theirs. He was in his late 50s, heavy-shouldered, gray at the temples, and he had a face that might have been good-looking once and had curdled into something harder. He was reading. He didn't look up when she came in. Gideon Voss. She crossed the room toward him at the same ordinary pace, and she made it almost all the way to his table, before his eyes came up from the papers and found her, and in the fraction of a second before he organized his expression, she saw pure, flat surprise. "Who the hell are you?" he said. "My name is Mara Bellamy. I own a ranch about 40 miles north of here." She stood at the edge of his table and looked down at him and did not sit, because sitting would have reduced her immediate options. "Your men spent 3 days on my property, trying to find something you lost." Something moved behind his eyes, the rapid calculation of a man who was used to assessing threats quickly. "You came here alone?" "To talk, yes. To talk." He repeated it with a particular flatness that told her he was deciding, right now, whether she was a threat or an opportunity. "Sit down, I'd rather stand." "Sit down, Mrs. Bellamy." His voice didn't change pitch, but it changed weight. And the 3 men at the other tables, she noticed, had stopped whatever they'd been doing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair with the specific ease of a man who was performing ease rather than feeling it. "You've been harboring fugitives, a wanted criminal and 2 children that are legally under my guardianship. That's an interesting description of a man protecting orphans from the person who killed their parents." The ease didn't shift in any visible way. "That's a serious accusation. I have serious evidence." Now something moved, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, quick enough that she almost missed it. "Whatever Rourke told you." "Rourke didn't tell me. Thomas Hartley did. Specifically, the documents Thomas sent to Abraham Whitlock for safekeeping did. Before your men burned the land office and the recorder's building, which covered the local record but didn't touch what Whitlock had been holding. For 2 years, she watched his face. Signed statements, financial records, and a written confession from a man named Corvin Aldred describing exactly what you paid him to do to the Hartley family. The silence in the room was total. Voss's glass was on the table between them. His hand was near it, but not touching it. She tracked his hand and his eyes simultaneously and watched for the moment one of them would move. "Aldred is dead," Voss said. "The confession isn't." He looked at her, and she saw in his face the moment when the calculation shifted, when she stopped being a variable he could absorb and became a problem that required a different solution. His eyes moved, just briefly, to the man behind the bar. She was already moving when the man behind the bar moved. Came up out of the chair and to the left, which put the table between her and the bar, and she had the handgun out of her coat pocket and leveled at Voss's chest before the man behind the bar had fully committed to whatever he'd been about to do. The 3 men at the tables had risen, but not drawn. They were reading the situation, reading Voss, waiting. "Tell him to stop," she said. Voss looked at the gun. Then he looked at her face, and she understood from his expression that he was reading her the way he read everything, looking for the bluff, looking for the shake in the hands or the uncertainty in the eyes. He didn't find it because it wasn't there, and that seemed to genuinely surprise him. "Stop," he said to the man behind the bar. Flat, definitive. The man stopped. From somewhere above them, from the direction of the staircase, she heard a door. Footsteps. The sounds of people moving who were trying not to make sound, which made its own kind of sound. Elias, and hopefully the judge. She needed 45 more seconds. "You should know," she said, keeping her voice even and her eyes on Voss, "that the documents are not in this building. I'm not carrying them. What I am is the distraction, and you've already been distracted long enough." Voss looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she recognized from a long time ago, the specific cold fury of a man who has realized he's been outmaneuvered and is filing that information away for later use, rather than letting it show in the present moment. "You're smarter than you look," he said. "Everyone tells me that," she said. Then the door behind her opened, and 2 things happened at once. Elias came down the stairs fast with a man. She didn't know who was moving carefully and holding papers against his chest. And from the front door of the hotel came a sound that stopped everyone in the room. A slow clap, 1 pair of hands, deliberate, unhurried. Silas Crow stepped through the hotel door and stood with a rifle across his chest and a smile that didn't reach anything above his jaw. He was perhaps 50, lean in a way that suggested the lean was habitual rather than natural, with pale eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who had no reason to hurry because the exits were already covered. He looked at Elias. "There you are," he said. His voice was mild. The voice of someone greeting an acquaintance. 15 years is a long time to run. Elias had gone very still on the staircase. Mara could see the muscle working in his jaw from across the room. "Silas," he said, "I want to explain something to the room." Crow said, conversationally, to no one in particular. He wasn't pointing his rifle at anyone yet. He didn't need to. He was reading the room correctly, understanding that the threat was more effective as a posture than as an action right now. Elias Rourke is a wanted man. He's a former member of an outlaw gang responsible for more than a dozen killings across 3 territories. The woman beside him broke the law taking him in. The documents they're carrying were obtained by breaking into a licensed attorney's office. He looked at the man Elias had brought down from upstairs the judge, she assumed, from the way he held himself, Clay. "I'm sure you can see that nothing you've been shown tonight has a legal chain of custody." Clay was older than she'd expected, 70, perhaps, with white hair and the controlled face of a man who'd spent decades hearing things in courtrooms that surprised him and had learned not to show it. He looked at Crow. He looked at the papers in his hands. Then he looked at Voss. "Who is this man?" he said. Not to Crow, to Voss, didn't answer. "He's the man Voss hired to find us," Mara said. She kept the gun on Voss. "His name is Silas Crow. He's been tracking Elias Rourke for 15 years, on behalf of the Black Ridge Gang." She looked at Clay directly. "Judge Clay, the documents are a full record of Gideon Voss ordering the murders of Thomas and Clara Hartley. There's a signed confession from the man Voss hired to carry it out. There are land deeds proving the Hartley family's legal ownership. There are financial records showing the false debt Voss fabricated." She paused. "Whatever the chain of custody question is, the content is what it is." Clay looked at her steadily. Then he looked at Crow. Then he looked at Voss again. "Mr. Voss," he said, in the particular voice of a man who had earned a certain authority through longevity and was not inclined to surrender it to someone with a rifle. "I've known you for 11 years. I've eaten at your table. I've presided over transactions that have made you a wealthy man in this territory." He paused. "I will tell you now, in front of this room, that I intend to review those documents. And I will tell you that the presence of an armed man in the doorway, suggesting that I shouldn't, is having approximately the opposite of the intended effect." Crow's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes changed. "Judge," he started. "Sit down," Clay said, as if addressing an unruly witness. "Or leave. Those are the choices." What happened in the next 4 minutes was not what Mara had planned, because she had not fully anticipated the specific way that Silas Crow would respond to being told to sit down by a 70-year-old judge in a burning town. She'd assumed he would calculate, weigh the options, decide that the risk of an immediate confrontation was greater than the risk of a strategic retreat, fall back and regroup. That was what a rational man would do. Crow was rational. He was also a man for whom 15 years of a single purpose had narrowed his judgment in specific ways. He moved toward Elias instead of toward the door. It was faster than she'd expected from a man his age, and it crossed the distance between the hotel entrance and the staircase in about 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she moved the gun from Voss to Crow. And Elias moved from the staircase to the floor, and Voss's hand came up from the table with the derringer he'd had in his lap since she'd sat down, and everything in the room happened at once. The shot from Voss's derringer hit the chair behind her. She went left and down. Elias and Crow hit the floor together, not a shot, just collision. 2 men who knew each other's fighting style from years of proximity, trying to use that knowledge at the same time. Clay pressed himself against the wall. The 3 men at the tables drew and looked at each other, and at Mara and at the general chaos, and made the decision, not all of them, but 2 of them, to head for the door. Mara came up with the handgun and fired once at the ceiling. Everything stopped. Into the silence, she said. "Enough." Voss had the derringer had fired, and he didn't have another shot without reloading, and she was close enough that the question of who moved faster was not one she expected him to want to answer. He lowered his hand. Crow and Elias were on the floor, both of them breathing hard. Elias had taken a cut across his cheekbone. from something the edge of a table or the floor she couldn't tell. And Crow had a split lip and was looking at Elias with the specific expression of a man re-evaluating a situation. He had lost the rifle somewhere in the fall. He could see that she had the gun. He got up slowly. He looked at her. He looked at Elias getting up beside her. Then he looked at Voss. "This isn't over," he said, to Elias specifically. "I know," Elias said. He was breathing carefully, managing the side. "It hasn't been over for 15 years. And the judge reading some papers doesn't change what you are." "I know that too." Crow looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked to the door and went through it and was gone into the night. The two men who'd headed for the door had already gone. The one who'd stayed was looking at Mara's gun and calculating the same odds she was, and arriving at the same conclusion. "Sit down," she told him. He sat down. Voss had not moved. He was looking at Judge Clay with an expression that was doing its best to be nothing at all and not entirely succeeding. Clay was looking back at him with the particular stillness of a man who was running a very long calculation. "I'll want those documents now," Clay said to Mara. She went to the door and opened it, and called for Dodd 3 times, which wasn't the signal but was clear enough in 30 seconds later. Dodd appeared with the oilcloth package, and she handed it to Judge Clay, and Clay sat down at Voss's table under the lamplight and began to read. Voss watched him read. Mara watched Voss. Elias stood beside her, close enough that his arm was touching hers, and she could feel through that contact that he was managing something physical, the wound, or Crow, or both, and she didn't say anything about it, because there was nothing to say that he didn't already know. Outside, the 2 buildings were still burning. The smoke came under the door in thin fingers. Someone in the street was shouting one of Voss's men, she thought, but the shout didn't come any closer, and she thought that maybe the men who'd left the hotel had taken some of the energy of the situation with them. Clay read for a long time. The room stayed quiet in the particular way that rooms stayed quiet when something irrevocable was happening. Finally, he looked up. He looked at Voss. He looked at the confession from Aldred, which he held separately from the rest, and he set it down on the table with great care. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I've been a territorial judge for 22 years. In that time, I have made judgments I'm proud of and judgments I'm not. I have also made the mistake, on more than one occasion, of confusing a man's apparent respectability with actual virtue." He folded his hands on the table. "I won't be making that mistake tonight." Voss's jaw tightened. "You will remain in this room," Clay said, "until the territorial marshal can be reached. I'm going to send a rider from this town tonight." He looked at Mara. "Can that be arranged?" "It can," she said. "Then it will be." He looked back at Voss. "I suggest you use the time to think carefully about whether cooperation will serve your interests better than what you've been doing." Voss said nothing. He looked at the documents on the table, at the evidence of everything he'd built and planned and paid for, and arranged, and his face went through something she couldn't name. Not remorse. Something colder and more private. The look of a man watching something he'd constructed fall apart and calculating how far the debris would travel. Outside, from the direction of the church, she heard something, not a shot, not a shout, just movement. Many feet moving. She went to the window and looked out. Ephraim was crossing the street with June and May. He was moving fast. Too fast. Behind him from the south were more riders coming in, not Voss's men. Different horses, different posture. She looked at Elias. "Riders from the south," she said. Her voice was even. "Not Voss's." He came to the window. He looked. Then something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and was now cautiously considering letting go. "That's a marshal's badge on the lead rider," he said. "I can see the light on it." She looked again. He was right. Then Ephraim was at the hotel door, coming through it with both babies, and the look on his face of a man who had been alone with 2 infants in a barricaded church, while a town burned around him and had come through it intact on the outside, and something else entirely on the inside. He looked at Mara. He looked at the situation in the room, at Voss sitting at the table, at the judge with the documents, at Elias beside her. "The marshal's coming," he said. "I know," she said. "We can see." He looked at June, who had woken up and was looking at the room with the bright, indiscriminate interest of an 8-month-old encountering new things. Then he looked at May, who was asleep with her cheek flattened against his shoulder. Then he looked at Mara again, and something moved across his weathered face that he didn't give a name to, and she didn't ask him to. "We all right," he said. She thought about Crow, out in the dark somewhere. She thought about Voss's other men, still armed, still on the street. She thought about what Clay had just said, and what the marshal's arrival would mean, and what happened next, which was a very long road that didn't have a clear end yet. "We're not finished," she said, "but we're standing." Ephraim nodded once, like that was the only answer he'd needed. Outside, the marshal's riders came into the firelit street, and from the south end of town, the burning buildings sent up a last great column of smoke and spark into the Wyoming night. And Gideon Voss sat at his own table with his own whiskey in front of him and looked at the evidence of everything he'd done. And Mara Bellamy stood in the middle of it all, with her hand pressed against the sleeping weight of a child against her chest. And for one long moment, everything held very still, the way things held still at the top of a wave before the water decided which way to fall. The marshal's name was Harlan Brett, and he was not what Mara had expected. And the marshal she'd built a picture in her head during the 30 seconds between seeing the badge flash in the firelight and the man walking through the hotel door, a picture assembled from the marshal she'd known and the marshal she'd heard about, which tended toward the same general type. Large, loud, the kind of authority that announced itself before it entered a room. What came through the door instead was a man of medium height and maybe 55 years, with a gray beard trimmed close, and the particular economy of movement of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had stopped wasting energy on anything that wasn't necessary. He looked at the room, at Voss, sitting at the table, at Clay with the documents, at Mara with the gun, at Elias, at Ephraim with the babies, and his expression did not change in any detectable way. "Judge Clay," he said. "Marshal Brett." Clay rose partway from the chair. "Your timing is better than I had any right to expect. We were already 2 days out from Laramie when the rider found us." Brett looked at Voss. Then he looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked at Mara again with the specific assessment of a man deciding how many separate problems he was looking at. "You're the woman from the Bellamy ranch." "Yes. You brought the Hartley evidence." "We did. We." He looked at Elias. Elias met his eyes and said nothing and did not look away, which Mara noted was the right choice. Brett looked at him for a moment that had some weight to it. Then he looked at the Blackridge scar on Elias's forearm, which the sleeve had ridden up enough to expose, and the weight increased and settled, and Brett let it settle without commenting on it. "I'll want statements from everyone in this room," he said, "tonight before anyone sleeps." He looked at 2 of his deputies who had come in behind him. "Get him secured," he said, and they moved toward Voss with the efficiency of people who had done this particular thing before. Voss stood. He didn't resist. He looked at the deputy, who reached for his arm, and he looked, for one moment, directly at Mara with an expression that she catalogued carefully, not the fury she'd expected, not the calculation. Something flatter and colder, the expression of a man who was already building the next version of his plan. She filed it away. "This isn't a conviction," he said, calmly, to the room generally. "No," Clay said. "That comes later. Tonight is just the beginning of the accounting." They took him out. The room felt different after he left, not lighter, exactly, but less pressurized. Like a door had been opened in a room where the air had been sitting too long. Statements took ugly laugh. The statements took 3 hours. Brett ran them with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that the paper record was going to matter more than any of their intentions. And he took them one at a time in the corner of the hotel's main room, while his deputies, the door, set, and Clay sat at the table going through the documents in the meticulous way of a man who was building a legal architecture one brick at a time. Mara went first. She told it plainly, without editorializing, the way she'd learned to speak when the truth was complicated enough that decoration only obscured it. The barn, the blizzard, the wound, the riders, the ridge, Ridgemont, the tunnel. She told it in order, leaving nothing out, including the part where she'd shot a man's horse instead of the man, and why. Brett listened without expression. He wrote things down. When she finished, he asked 3 questions that were specific enough to tell her. He'd already been building the picture from somewhere else, from Whitlock, she suspected, or from the rider who'd found him on the Laramie Road. "The man Crow," he said. "He left the hotel." "Yes." "Direction? I didn't see." He went out the front door and into the street. "My men are looking." He said it without reassurance in his voice, which she actually found reassuring. She didn't need to be managed. He won't get far in this weather. She thought about saying what she actually believed, was that Silas Crow had survived in this territory for 15 years as a man with a price on his head and probably knew more about moving through winter country than most of Brett's men. She decided not to say it. Elias went last. She was not in the room for his statement, but she could hear the low, flat register of his voice through the thin partition, and she could hear the particular pauses that came when Brett asked something that required more than a simple answer. His past, the gang, what he'd done and for how long and for whom. She did not try to hear the specific words. She sat against the wall near Ephraim and held June in her lap and watched May sleep in the improvised basket Dodd had made from a wooden crate and a folded blanket, and she thought about what came next. What came next was the part that was not in her plan. Plan had gotten them to Copper Springs. The plan had gotten the documents to Clay. The plan had accomplished, more or less, what it needed to accomplish, and now the plan was done, and in its absence there was a set of questions that had no clear answers. Voss was in custody, but Voss had lawyers and money and connections built over 30 years in the territory, and custody was not conviction. And Clay himself had said it tonight was just the beginning of the accounting. The legal process would take months. It might take longer. And until it resolved, the Hartley girls were in a territory where Voss still had people who were loyal to him, some of whom were in Copper Springs right now and had not been rounded up, and Crow was loose. And the ranch was 40 miles north with no one in it, and the winter not half over. She looked at June, who was awake, and regarding her with the steady, dark-eyed attention that June had been directing at her for days now, not demanding, not needy, just watchful, like the child was taking the measure of her and had not yet finished. "What?" Mara said quietly. June grabbed Mara's finger. She looked at the small hand, wrapped around her finger, and felt the cracked open place in her chest do the complicated thing again. And she let it, because there was no one looking, and she was tired of not letting it. Elias came out of the partition corner 20 minutes later and sat down beside her on the wall. He looked at June. He looked at Mara's face. He didn't say anything for a minute, which she appreciated. Then he said, "Brett's going to want me in Laramie." Assumed, not arrested. He said he used the word cooperation. He wants full testimony about Blackridge, names, operations, locations, in exchange for consideration on the outstanding warrants. Consideration. His word. She thought about this. How many outstanding warrants? A pause. 4. What kind? Another pause. Longer. The kind that come from 6 years of doing what the Blackridge gang did. He didn't soften it, which she noticed. "I've never killed anyone who didn't need killing by my own accounting, but my accounting and the law's accounting aren't the same document." "No," she said, "they wouldn't be." Brett seemed not unsympathetic, but he was clear that cooperation wasn't the same as freedom. "Is that what you want, freedom?" He looked at her. It was a real question, and she'd asked it as one, and he seemed to understand that. "I want the girls to be safe," he said. "I want Thomas's name to mean something. He stopped, started again, more carefully. "I want to stop running. That's what I want. What that looks like on the other side of a legal process is something I don't have a clear picture of yet." June made a sound. Both of them looked at her. She was still holding Mara's finger. "You should sleep," Mara told him. "So should you." "I will when I'm done thinking. That could take a while." "Probably," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very low, "Thank you for not leaving." She looked at the sleeping May and the watchful June and the oilcloth package that was now in Clay's possession, and the hotel room that was quieter than it had been an hour ago, and the winter dark outside the windows, and she thought about the barn door slamming open in the middle of a blizzard, which now felt like it had happened in another life, even though it had been 4 days ago. "Go to sleep, Elias," she said. He went to sleep. She was still awake 2 hours later, when the first shot came through the hotel window. Came without warning, a single rifle crack from somewhere on the street, and the window above the bar dissolved inward in a spray of cold air and glass, and the lamp on the bar went out as the draft hit it. Mara was on her feet before the echo finished. She had June in her arms already. She'd been holding her, and she went low and moved toward Ephraim, who had come up from the floor with the speed of a man whose body remembered how to respond to gunfire, even when his mind was still organizing itself. "May," she said. He already had her, both babies. She didn't know how he'd done it that fast, but he had. Brett's deputies were moving. She could hear them. The boots on the floor, the voices. From outside came more shots, not random. Organized a rhythm, that told her someone had positioned multiple shooters, which told her this was not opportunistic. This was planned. Back room, Brett was saying, moving through the space with a lantern low. Everyone back room now. Elias was beside her. He'd come awake fast, the way he always did, with no visible transition between sleep and full alertness. He had the rifle. He looked at Mara. Crow, she said. Or Voss's remaining men. Or both. He looked at the window. The shots had paused, reloading, repositioning. They're not trying to kill us. If they were, the first shot would have been better aimed. They want the documents. Or they want Voss freed. Or they want the girls. His jaw was tight. Does it matter which right now? It didn't. She moved. The back room of the hotel was a storage space, barrels, crates, shelving. One door leading to the alley. Brett had 4 deputies and himself, which was 5 armed men in addition to Elias, Dodd, and Ferris, who'd come in from the alley when the shooting started. It was not a small force. It was also pinned. How many do you think? Brett said to the room. At least 8, Ferris said. He'd gone to the back door and cracked it and looked out and come back. They've got the alley covered too. 1 man, maybe 2 west end. The document box, Clay said. He was in the corner, pale but steady, the oilcloth package under his arm. If they destroy this, they won't get it, Brett said. Can't promise that. No, Brett said, but I can make it cost them. Mara handed June to Ephraim. Both babies were awake and not crying, which was either because they were too tired or too overwhelmed, and she didn't have time to determine which. She looked at Ephraim, and he looked at her with the expression he had when he was about to say something she wasn't going to like. There's a cellar, he said. I checked when we first came in. The trapdoor is under the 3rd shelf. There. He nodded at the far wall. I don't know where it goes. It goes to the laundry, Dodd said. Everyone looked at him. My brother-in-law built this hotel. The cellar connects to the building. Next door. There's a passage. It's low, but a person can get through it. What's the building next door? Feed store. Empty this time of year. Back of it opens onto the north alley, away from where they've got men. Mara looked at Brett. He was doing the same calculation she was. Someone needs to go, she said, with Clay and the girls. Get them clear of the building. And someone needs to stay, Brett said. He looked at his deputies. He looked at Elias. He looked at Mara. 3 shooters at the windows would give the others time to move. 2, Elias said. You need someone who knows the north alley to guide them. Dodd, Mara said. Dodd nodded. He didn't look happy about it, but he nodded. Then 2, Brett said. He looked at his deputies. He was going to assign them. She could see him organizing it, and then Elias said, Me and Mara, in a tone that was not a suggestion, and Brett stopped and looked at them both. She expected him to argue. He didn't. 2 minutes, he said. Then we move. She looked at Ephraim. He already had both babies against his chest. 1 arm each, and the look on his face of a man who has made peace with several possible outcomes and is carrying the weight of that peace physically in the line of his shoulders and the set of his jaw. Ephraim, she said. I know, he said. It wasn't enough, and it was all there was. She touched May's head, and then June's. 1 quick warm press of her palm, and then she went to the window beside Elias, and they took their positions, and the 2 minutes began. The shooting, when it started in earnest, was the kind that required presence of mind rather than courage. Because courage was something you could run out of, and presence of mind was something you either had in the moment or you didn't. Mara had it. She and Elias worked the 2 windows systematically, not trying to hit anyone specifically, not wasting shots, just maintaining a volume of return fire that made it expensive to approach the hotel from the front or the east side alley. They communicated without words. She'd fire and he'd move. He'd fire and she'd reload. The rhythm of it found itself without needing to be established, which told her something she didn't have time to think about. From below and behind them, she heard the trapdoor. Movement. The sounds of people getting smaller and going underground. Clay, Ephraim, the babies, going. She felt it as a physical thing, the babies moving away from her, through the floor and the ground, into a passage she couldn't see or follow. She noted that feeling and set it aside. The shots from outside were concentrating on the front now. They'd noticed the reduced return fire from the east alley. Whoever was directing this was paying attention. 2 of Brett's deputies were holding the east side. Brett himself was at the front door, pinning it. They're trying to work around to the north, Elias said, between shots. Feed store, she said. He looked at her. They know about the passage, he started. Move, she said. They left the window positions and went for the trapdoor. One of Brett's deputies started to say something, and Brett stopped him with a word. She went down the ladder first into the low, dark, earthen-smelling space below, and Elias came down behind her and pulled the trapdoor shut over them. The passage was exactly what Dodd had described: low, narrow, cold, smelling of the mineral dark. She moved through it fast, bent at the waist, one hand on the earthen wall. The lantern was gone with Ephraim's group, but the passage ran straight, and she could feel the air moving from ahead. Meant an opening. She came up into the feed store cellar and stopped. Voices above her, not familiar ones. She looked back at Elias, who had heard it too. He held up 2 fingers, 2 men overhead, moving carefully. Looking for something. She pointed up. He nodded. She pointed at herself and then at the stair. At the far end of the cellar there was a stair, barely visible in the thin light coming through the floor planks above. He pointed at himself and then at the trapdoor directly above them. She went for the stair. The feed store's main floor was a single large room, bins and shelving, and the dusty smell of grain that had been emptied for winter. 2 men were moving through it, with a lantern, checking behind the shelving. They hadn't found the cellar stair yet because it was hidden behind a flour bin that had been left in front of it. Came up behind the flour bin and stayed low and looked at them between the bin and the wall. Young men, both of them. Vosses, she guessed, by the horses she could see through the store's north window. 3 horses tied at the back post, meaning a third man somewhere. The 2 inside were not Crow. She'd know Crow. The trapdoor in the floor on the other side of the room lifted, and Elias came through it, and both men spun. And Mara came around the flour bin at the same moment and said, "Don't," in a voice that did not require volume to land with force. Both men stood very still. "Put them down," she said. The rifle, the handgun, to both of them. One of them did. The other, young, scared, calculating, looked at the door. "Don't," Elias said from behind them. He didn't. He put it down. "Tie them," she told Elias. He looked around the store and found rope in under 30 seconds, which was either experience or instinct. She held the gun on both men and watched the north window while he worked. The shooting from the hotel had changed, less frequent, more deliberate. She didn't know what that meant yet. "The third horse," she said, to the man who'd hesitated. "Who's the third rider?" He didn't answer. "Not Crow," she said. "Crow doesn't ride with other people." "Who is it?" Still nothing. "It's Voss," Elias said from behind her. He finished the rope and stood up. He was looking at the north window. "Voss is out." She spun and looked. He was right. Through the north window, in the thin gray light that was just beginning to separate the sky from the ground, it was almost dawn, she registered, which surprised her. She could see 3 horses, and one of them was occupied. A man in the saddle, watching the hotel, watching the street. Gideon Voss on a horse meant Gideon Voss was not in custody, which meant something had happened to the deputies who'd been holding him. She was already moving toward the north door. The north alley was cold and clear, and the sky above it was starting to go the deep blue that came just before light. The shooting had stopped. The sudden absence of it was almost loud. Mara came out of the feed store at a low run and made for the corner of the building, putting the wall between herself and where Voss had been sitting his horse, and she stopped there and looked back to see Elias right behind her. "He's moving," Elias said. He'd seen through the window. "Which way?" "South, away from the marshal's men." He's running. She thought about this. Running Voss was a better Voss than cornered Voss. Legally speaking, a man who fled custody in front of a territorial marshal had just handed his own defense over to the prosecution. But running Voss was also a Voss who was still armed and still had men in the area and had not yet accepted that the game was over. "The girls," she said. They moved. The north alley led to the back of the church. She found Ephraim there outside, visible, which meant the immediate threat around the church had been contained, or at least reduced. He had both babies and Dodd beside him, and Clay against the church wall with the documents still under his arm. And he was looking at Mara with the expression of someone who had been running calculations about what might be happening 2 buildings away, and not liking any of the numbers. "Voss got loose," she said. "I heard shots stop," he said. "I didn't know what that meant." "Neither did I." "Where are Brett's men?" 3 of them came around the north end 10 minutes ago. Went south. He paused. One of them was limping. "Brett, then, or most of him, in pursuit." "Stay here," she told Ephraim. "Mara, stay here. Don't move. Don't open the church door. Don't let Clay out of your sight." She looked at him directly. I mean it. I know you mean it. He looked at Elias. Something passed between the two men that she didn't have the full context for, but understood in outline the look of a man passing a responsibility to another man who, he'd decided at some point in the last 4 days, was capable of holding it. You bring her back, Ephraim said. Working on it, Elias said. They went south. The main street of Copper Springs in the first gray light of dawn looked like a place that had survived something and wasn't yet sure whether to be relieved. The two buildings were still smoldering no more flame, just the steady exhalation of structures that had burned through and were now just cooling wreckage. Glass in the hotel window. Hoof prints in the snow going in several directions. Two of Voss's men sitting against the far building, with their hands tied in front of them. One of Brett's deputies standing over them with the expression of a man who had been awake all night and was maintaining function through resentment rather than an energy. Brett, no sign. Of Voss, no sign. Of Crow, nothing, which remained the most troubling absence on the list. She and Elias moved down the street, and the deputy with the prisoners said, Marshall went south. Ma'am, he went after Voss. And she nodded and kept moving. The south end of town gave onto open land, the valley floor, flat and white, broken by a tree line half a mile out. The tracks in the snow were clear, one horse moving fast, and then behind it, 3 horses moving less fast. Brett's pursuit. The gap between them looked manageable if Voss's horse tired. He's heading for the tree line, Elias said. He won't make it before Brett gets close, unless his horse is fresher. He looked at her. We need horses. They went to the livery, which still had the animals they'd stabled the night before. The boy who'd taken them was gone sensible child, she thought, but the horses were there, and she saddled hers with hands that were not entirely steady, and told herself that was not nerves, and got on. They rode south. They found Brett's men at the tree line, horses gathered in a loose group, the 3 deputies standing at the edge of the trees looking in. Brett was 30 feet ahead of them, on foot, moving between the pines. Mara and Elias pulled up, and she looked at the deputies. Where, she said. One of them pointed. She could see the horse first, Voss's horse tied to a pine, no rider. Then she saw Brett, and then she saw why Brett had stopped walking. Voss was there, back against a tree, and beside him against another tree, arms at his sides. A rope across his chest was Elias. It was not Elias. It took her 1 full second of wrong understanding, before she corrected it, and in that second everything went very cold. And then she saw that it was a man about Elias's height and build, with the same general coloring, and that the man had been tied there recently and was not conscious, and that Voss had his gun against the man's temple and was looking directly at her. That's Deputy Reeves, one of Brett's men said quietly. He went ahead of the marshal. Voss had taken his own hostage. I want a horse, Voss said. He was talking to Brett, but he was watching Mara, which told her he'd assessed the situation and decided she was the relevant variable. And I want the document package. The woman has it, or she knows where it is. He pressed the gun slightly. Reeves was unconscious and couldn't react to it, which was somehow worse. I have a man inside the town who has the children. You send the marshal back alone for the package. The deputy walks away unharmed. Brett's voice was very controlled. You don't have a man inside the town, Voss. We have your men in custody. Do you have all of them? Pause. Brett didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Mara looked at the tree line and the horse and the deputy and Voss, and she did the same calculation she'd been doing for 5 days, the one with changing variables, and she felt Elias go very still beside her. There's no version of this, Elias said to her, quiet enough for just her, where he doesn't use that hostage regardless of what you do. So whatever you're thinking, I'm thinking there are 4 armed men standing at the tree line, and none of them are moving because they don't want to be the thing that makes his finger move. She looked at him. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? He looked at what she was looking at, the angle, the trees, the way Voss's attention was distributed between Brett in front of him and herself at the tree line, the way the gun was positioned against Reeves's head. He was quiet for a moment. He can't watch both sides at once, he said. No. If something comes from his left, he'll move the gun. Instinct. Away from the hostage or toward, away. He needs the hostage alive to have leverage. Shooting him loses the card. Elias looked at the angle again. That's a small gap. Yes. If I'm wrong about the instinct, then you're wrong. She looked at him. But you're not. He held her gaze for 1 moment. Then he said, give me 30 seconds. Don't do anything until you hear me. He moved into the trees to the left quietly, using the coverage of the pines. She watched him go and then looked back at Voss and kept her face neutral and waited. Voss was talking to Brett again. Terms, conditions. The language of a man who was performing confidence he was not fully feeling. Because his situation had narrowed considerably in the last hour and he was sophisticated enough to know it. He was watching the marshal. He was watching Mara. He was not quite watching the trees to his left. Counted. At 28, she said, loudly and clearly, Voss. He looked at her. Those documents are already in the territorial judge's hands. They were there before midnight, burning the land office, burning the recorder's office. None of that changes what Clay has. And Clay had a full night to read it. She paused. You're not getting out of this territory with your freedom, no matter what happens in these trees. The only question is whether you get out with your life. His eyes were on her. The gun was against Reeves's temple, and his hand was on it, and his eyes were on her. Then from his left a branch moved. His head turned. His arm turned with it, the gun pulling instinctively away from Reeves's temple as the threat perception shifted, left just 2 inches, just for a second, and in that second Brett moved, covering the 30 feet between them at a dead run, and Mara was already off her horse. What happened in the next 15 seconds was not clean. It was not the version of things that resolved neatly. Brett hit Voss from behind, and they went down together. The gun went off into the ground, harmlessly, into the snow between the pine roots. Voss was strong, and Brett was not young, and for several seconds there was a fight that neither man was winning with any clarity, and then Elias was there, having come through the trees at the shot, and it was 3-1, and even so Voss didn't stop fighting until the second set of hands got his gun arm pinned against the tree, and Brett got the cuffs on. Then he stopped. He went still. He lay in the snow between the pine roots, and looked up at the gray sky and breathed hard, and his face did the thing it had done in the hotel, the cold internal calculation, the assessment of what was left, and whatever he found, whatever remained available in the options he was working through, it was not enough. She could see the exact moment he understood it was not enough. She looked away from his face. She didn't need to see that moment. It wasn't hers. Reeves was still tied to the tree and still unconscious. One of the deputies was untying him. He'd have a bad headache and some bruised ribs from where Voss had hit him, but he was breathing steadily. Elias was standing 10 feet away. He was breathing carefully, the side again. She could tell by the breath, and he was looking at us the way you looked at something you'd been moving toward for a long time and had now arrived at and didn't quite know what to do with the arrival. His face was complicated in ways she didn't press. She went and stood beside him. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The morning light was fully there now, gray and cold, and the particular flat white of a winter sky that wasn't going to offer warmth today, but was at least offering visibility, and she stood in it beside the man who'd collapsed in her barn 5 days ago, and looked at the man who'd caused all of it, lying in the snow between the pine roots, and she let the silence be what it was. Brett hauled Voss to his feet. 2 deputies flanked him. He walked without resisting now, which was almost more unsettling than the fighting had been. Your testimony, Brett said to Elias as he passed. Not unkindly. I'll need it soon. You'll have it, Elias said. They walked Voss back through the trees toward the town. She and Elias stayed at the tree line for another minute. She could feel the exhaustion in her own body, 5 days of it, stacked up and patient, waiting for the moment she stopped moving to present its full account. Her hands were cold. Her back was talking to her again about the 2 nights in the chair. She was aware of being very tired in a way that went further than sleep would fix. It's not over, she said. Not a complaint, just the accounting of it. The trial, he said. Crow's still loose. Whatever Brett decides about, he stopped. He didn't finish the sentence, but she heard the end of it. Whatever Brett decides about me. I know none of it is going to be simple. No, it's not going to be simple. She looked at him. But Voss is in cuffs. Clay has the evidence. The girls are in the church with Ephraim. She paused. Simple was never the thing we were after. He looked at her. The morning light was in his face, and he looked tired and unguarded in a way she'd come to recognize as the version of him that was most honestly present, not the managed stillness of someone trying to control how he was being read. The face underneath that, the one that came through when there wasn't enough energy left to maintain the distance. I don't know how he started. You don't have to, she said. Not right now. He nodded once. It was a small nod. It carried a lot. She looked back at the town, at the buildings, and the smoke, and the tracks in the snow, and the place where the sun was making its flat winter effort somewhere behind the clouds. And then she looked at the tree line and thought about Crow, out there, somewhere, because that was the thread that hadn't resolved. He was still out there, and she knew enough about him now to know that a man like that didn't simply dissolve when circumstances turned against him. She thought about Ephraim, and the babies in the church, and the long ride back north that was going to have to happen, eventually, and the ranch sitting empty and cold 40 miles away. She thought about all of it, and she was still thinking when Elias said quietly, "We should go back." "Yes," she said, "we should." They went back. And behind them in the trees, in the particular silence of a pine forest, after a night of violence, something moved a branch, settling back. A weight recently removed. The print of a boot in the snow, pointed north, already beginning to fill, with the thin new snow that had started falling, slow and quiet, covering tracks the way Wyoming winter always covered everything eventually. Crow, already moving, already ahead of them. The boot print in the snow was the thing that stayed with her on the ride back north. Not Voss in cuffs, not Clay with the documents pressed against his chest like something sacred. Not the relief on Ephraim's face when she walked back through the church door, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her. When she came back from something he hadn't been sure she'd come back from. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But what her mind kept returning to, during the 2 days they spent in Copper Springs, while Brett organized his custody, and Clay wrote his initial findings, and the town tried to make sense of what had happened to it, was that boot print, already filling with snow, pointed north. Crow was going to her ranch. She knew it the way she knew weather. She told Elias on the second morning, over coffee in the hotel's repaired main room, and he was quiet for long enough that she knew he'd already been thinking it. "He has nowhere else to go," Elias said. "Voss is finished. The gang is scattered. Whatever Crow was being paid, the payment stops now." He turned the cup in his hands. "Which means the only thing left on his ledger is me, and anyone connected to you." He looked at her. "The ranch," she said. "He'd know that's where we're going. He'd know it's the place we have reason to defend. He'd also know it's isolated. 40 miles from Copper Springs, one road in, winter still on." He set the cup down. "He's going to try to finish it there. On ground he's had time to choose. Then we don't give him time." She stood up. "We leave today." They left that afternoon, the 5 of them, with the addition of Eleanor Brace, who had made it clear in the quiet, non-negotiable manner of a woman in her 70s that she was going wherever the girls went and that this was not a discussion. Mara had looked at her for a moment and said, "All right," and that had been the end of it. Brett had sent 2 of his deputies with them as far as the Ridgemont Junction, which was something, and had promised a marshal's presence at the ranch within the week, which was a different kind of something useful, but not immediate. The road north was cold and clear and uneventful, and the uneventfulness of it made Mara more alert, not less. She rode with her eyes moving constantly between the tree lines on both sides, and the road ahead, and the sky, which told its own kind of story in winter, if you knew how to read it. Elias rode beside her and did the same, and neither of them talked much, and the silence between them had stopped being the silence of people who didn't know each other, and become the silence of people who didn't need to fill space with words to be present in it. They reached the ranch on the evening of the 3rd day. The barn door was open, not the way it had been open the night. Elias arrived not blown wide by the storm, not an accident of wind. Opened deliberately, 1.5 feet, in the way someone left a door open who wanted you to know they were inside. Mara pulled her horse up 200 yards out and looked at it. Elias stopped beside her. Behind them, Ephraim was already telling Eleanor to stay back with the babies, in a voice that communicated that this was not optional. "He's in the barn," Elias said, "or he wants us to think he is." "No," he studied the door. "He's in the barn. That's Crow's style. He picks one place and he holds it and he waits. He doesn't scatter." He paused. "He'll have had 2 days here. He knows the layout. He knows the exits. What does he want? He wants to talk to me." He said it with the particular flatness of a certainty he didn't like. "That's what this is. If he wanted us dead, there'd be no open door. Men who want to talk don't usually require this kind of staging. Crow does." He looked at her. "He was my partner for 6 years. The way he sees it, I owe him a conversation. The 15 years of running, that was me refusing the conversation. Now he's decided to stop waiting." She looked at the barn door. She thought about all the ways this could go wrong and identified 9 of them before she stopped counting, because counting wasn't useful. "I go in with you," she said. "Mara, that wasn't a question." He looked at her face and understood, as he had eventually understood most things, that the decision was already made. "Then stay behind me until I say otherwise." "Stay behind you," she repeated. "Just until I know how he's positioned." "All right," she said. "Just until then." They dismounted and walked toward the barn. Crow was where Elias had said he'd be, in the back corner, on a hay bale, with a rifle across his knees and the posture of a man who'd been sitting comfortably for some time. He lit the barn's lamp and hung it at a height that illuminated the center of the space without reaching the corners, which was a choice that told Mara he'd thought carefully about sight lines. There was a bedroll near him. He'd slept here. He'd eaten. Here, there were provisions from her kitchen on the bale beside him, which annoyed her specifically and separately from everything else. He looked at Elias when they came in. He looked at Mara with the brief, assessing look he'd given her in the hotel. The look of a man recategorizing something. Then he looked back at Elias. "You look worse than the last time I saw you," he said. "You broke into my house," Mara said. "I needed shelter." He said it without apology. Not rudely, just factually, the way a practical man accounted for practical things. "I didn't damage anything. You ate my food. I left coin on the kitchen table." A pause. "I'm not a thief." She stared at him. He met it without discomfort. "Silas," Elias said. He'd stepped slightly forward, putting himself in the center of Crow's attention, which she understood was deliberate. "Say what you came to say." Crow looked at him for a long moment. In the lamplight, his face was older than she remembered from the hotel, not softer, but less performed. The smile was gone. What was underneath it was harder to name. "You gave testimony to Brett," he said. "Yes." "About Blackridge." "Names, operations, yes." Crow was quiet for a moment. "Men will die from that testimony." "Men from Blackridge killed the Hartley family," Elias said. "Men from Blackridge killed 3 other families I know of in the last 4 years. The dying that comes from the testimony is the accounting for the dying that came before it. And my name is in the testimony." He didn't look away. Crow's hand moved on the rifle, not raising it, just moving, adjusting the grip, the reflex of a man whose hands and weapons had a long conversational relationship. Mara tracked the movement and kept her own hand near her coat pocket and did not move yet. 15 years, Crow said. "We were partners for 6 years, and you've been running from me for 15. You know what that kind of running does to a man?" "I know what it did to me," Elias said. "I'm not asking about you." Silence. "I brought you in," Crow said. His voice had changed. Something had moved through it, something real and not managed. "You were 16, and you had nothing, and I brought you in. That means something where I come from." "I know it does." "You left without a word. You burned the barn, and you ran, and you never—" He stopped. He looked at the rifle in his hands like he was surprised to see it there. "I spent 15 years thinking you'd come back, thinking there'd be a conversation, some kind of accounting." "I know," Elias said. "Silas. I know." He took a step closer, which Mara did not love, but she held her position. "I was 16 when you found me, and I was grateful, and I stayed because of that gratitude, long after I understood what I was staying for. That's on me, but I couldn't come back. You know why? Because of the family. Because of what we were doing to families. Because of what I'd been part of doing." His voice was quiet and direct and entirely without performance. "Couldn't come back from that, and I couldn't explain it, and I ran. It was the coward's choice, and I knew it then, and I know it now. I'm not asking you to forgive it." Crow looked at him. The lamp moved slightly a draft from the barn's imperfect walls, and the light moved over both of them, and she saw in that moving light something she hadn't expected to see in Silas Crow's face. Not rage, not the cold, patient purpose he'd carried into the hotel. Just a man who had organized 15 years of his life around a wound and had arrived at the source of it and didn't know quite what to do with the arrival. She understood that. She understood it more than she wanted to. "Voss's money is gone," Crow said finally. "Yes. The gang is finished, or near enough. Near enough. And you gave my name to a territorial marshal." "Yes," Elias said. "I did. And I'm sorry for the parts of that I'm sorry for, and I'm not sorry for the parts I'm not." A long silence. Mara watched Crow's hands. "What happens now?" Crow said. Came out differently than she expected, not a threat. Almost a genuine question. "You put the rifle down," Elias said, "and you walk out of this barn, and you make whatever choices are left to you. Brett will find you eventually, or he won't. That's not mine to determine." He paused. "But not here. Not in front of those girls. Crow's eyes moved to Mara. She met them. "Those children are here?" he said. "Yes," she said. Something moved in his face. It was brief and not identifiable, and she decided not to try to identify it. He looked back at Elias. He looked at the rifle in his hands. Then he set it against the hay bale, butt down, barrel leaning away. He stood up. He was taller than she remembered. He looked at Elias for a long, last moment, the look of two people who shared something that had no clean name and would never fully resolve. And then he walked to the barn door, and through it, and into the dark, and was gone. She listened to his footsteps until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she exhaled. "He'll run." "Yes," Elias said. "Brett will find him. Maybe." A pause. "Probably not." She thought about that. She thought about justice, which was a thing she believed in, and a thing she'd also learned was inconsistent in its arrival, and sometimes failed to arrive at all. She thought about Crow walking out into the Wyoming dark and the long accounting of what he'd done and whether the world had any mechanism for collecting on it. Then she thought about the rifle left against the hay bale and the coin left on her kitchen table, and she filed those details in the complicated drawer where she kept the things that didn't fit the simple version of any story. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." Gideon Voss stood trial in Laramie the following spring. Proceedings took 11 days, which was long for the territory and short for the weight of what was being argued. Clay testified. Elias testified for 2 full days in a courtroom that was standing room only, speaking about Blackridge and Voss's hiring of Crow and the night the Hartley family died, in the same flat, direct voice he used for everything that mattered. Whitlock testified, having come forward voluntarily 2 weeks after Copper Springs, his sister brought safely from Laramie by Brett's men once Voss was fully contained. Voss was convicted on 4 counts: murder, kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy. The sentence was handed down on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon the legal process of restoring the Hartley inheritance to June and May had begun, which was slow and imperfect and required 3 separate filings and 2 corrections, and took another month, but arrived. Elias's warrants were addressed, as Brett had suggested they would be not erased, but substantially reduced by the testimony, by the actions taken on behalf of the Hartley girls, by Clay's formal commendation. 2 of the 4 warrants were dismissed outright. The remaining 2 resulted in a period of supervised release that required him to remain in Wyoming territory and available to the marshal's office for 18 months. He remained. He was available. He was also, during those 18 months, rebuilding the east fence line of the Bellamy ranch, which had come through the winter in rough shape, because that was what needed doing, and he was there and had the hands for it. Silas Crow was never apprehended. Brett's men tracked him to the Montana border in early March and lost him in the Beartooth country, and after that the trail went cold and stayed cold. Whether he went further north or crossed into something else, no one said for certain. Mara thought about him sometimes, not often, but sometimes when the wind came from the north and the land had that particular vastness that reminded you how small the human arrangements on it actually were. She thought about him, and then she put it away and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Eleanor Brace stayed at the ranch through the winter and into spring, and somewhere in that time the arrangement stopped feeling temporary. She was a practical woman who had opinions about everything, and was right about most of them and wrong about the rest, in ways that were at least interesting, and she loved June and May with the specific ferocity of someone who had lost too many people and was not prepared to be careful about the ones remaining. She took over the kitchen in a way that Mara, who had never been a natural cook, found more relief than offense. She argued with Ephraim about everything from fence posts to the correct way to store root vegetables, and Ephraim argued back, and the ranch that had been very quiet for 6 years was no longer quiet. June walked first, on a June morning which Ephraim pointed out, with the satisfied air of a man who considered this a personal achievement, as if he'd scheduled it. She walked 4 steps across the kitchen floor and then sat down hard and looked at her own legs with the expression of someone who was reconsidering their life choices. And everyone in the kitchen laughed and let out a short, ugly laugh, and May watched from her spot on the blanket with the focused expression she'd had since the beginning, the one that said she was taking notes. Mara signed the adoption papers on a Wednesday afternoon in Laramie, in an office that smelled of ink and old wood, with Elias sitting beside her and Ephraim standing against the wall looking at the ceiling in the particular way. He looked at the ceiling when he was trying not to show that he was moved. She didn't cry. She signed her name clearly and put down the pen and looked at it, at her name, at the legal language that rearranged the world into something closer to what it should have been from the beginning, and she sat with that for a moment. Right, Elias said. Yes, she said, and meant it. They married the following October on the ranch, because the ranch was where it had happened and where they were, and where they intended to stay. There were 11 people present, the people who had survived the winter with them, and a few who had joined the world of the ranch in the months since. Eleanor performed the ceremony because there was no one else available, and she had opinions about how it should be done, and those opinions proved correct. Ephraim stood beside Elias and looked at the sky again for most of it. It was not a large ceremony. It was not an elegant one. The food afterward was plentiful and imperfect, and June knocked her bowl off the table, and May ate things she was not supposed to eat, and nobody minded very much. Mara stood in her own yard, and the stood in her oven's hand, and looked at the land she'd built, and the people on it, and thought about the night the barn door had blown open in a blizzard, and a man had appeared in the hay, with 2 freezing infants, and the words, "They'll kill you too." She thought about what she'd done with that night. The choices it had set in motion, one after another, each one the result of the one before, the chain of them, leading here to this yard, this light, these people, these children who were hers now in every way that mattered. She thought about what it cost to make choices like that. It was not a small cost, it never was. The people who told you that doing right came easily were people who had never been asked to do it when it genuinely inconvenienced them, when it put something real at risk, when the sensible choice was the door that led away from the problem, and the right choice was the one that led directly into it. She had walked into it. She would walk into it again. That was not nobility. She was clear-eyed enough to know it wasn't nobility. It was just the thing she couldn't not do, the version of herself that wouldn't be quiet when she tried to silence it. Elias looked at her in the October light and didn't ask what she was thinking, because he'd learned that she'd tell him when she was ready and not before. She was ready. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said. In the tunnel in Ridgemont. About not running anymore. I remember. You've stopped," she said, "running. I can see it." He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about things that deserved seriousness. "Most days," he said. "That's honest. Most days is all I can promise." He looked at the land. "Some mornings I wake up and I'm still half gone, still moving in my head. Old habit." A pause. Then I hear Ephraim arguing with Eleanor about the potatoes, and it goes away. She laughed. It came out before she could be measured about it, which was how she preferred to laugh when she laughed. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd first seen in the tunnel, the one underneath the management, the one that was just him. "Goes away," he said again more quietly. "And then I'm here." Here was the right word for it. Here was the whole of it, the difficult, and the ongoing, and the imperfect, and the real. 2 girls who would grow up in this house and carry the name Hartley because it was theirs to keep, and the story of a winter because that was what you did with the things that had shaped you. The old man who'd ridden a ridge fight at 61 and never once complained about his knee. Fierce, certain old woman who had appointed herself the center of a family that had needed one. The man who had run for 15 years and stopped. The woman who had survived by making herself small and had chosen in the end to take up space. None of it was resolved into something clean. Crow was still out there somewhere. The legal aftermath of the Voss trial ran on for another 2 years and required periodic attention from people who found it exhausting. The ranch had hard winters and dry summers, and the kind of ongoing difficulty that land in Wyoming imposed on anyone who chose to work it. There were mornings that were harder than other mornings, and nights where the past came close, and ordinary days that were just ordinary and asked nothing of anyone. Those ordinary days were, in the end, the thing she'd wanted most and known at last. The blizzard that had brought Elias Rourke through her barn door in the winter of 1878 had nearly killed him, and nearly killed the children he carried, and had instead delivered them all to each other, and to this October yard, and to whatever came next. She didn't call that luck. She didn't call it anything that required a name. She just held her husband's hand in the last of the light, and listened to her daughters arguing inside the house, in the high, certain voices of children who are fully at home and felt the weight of the land under her feet, and the cold coming in off the north, and the particular fullness of a life that had been, against considerable odds, built into something she recognized as hers. The blizzard had done that, or they had, or both, which was usually how it went. The storm and the choices made inside it, neither one enough alone, both of them together, making something that neither could have made separately. She had lived alone for 6 years before that barn door opened. She had thought, in the careful way of someone who had learned to manage expectations of herself and the world, that alone was simply what she was going to be. That the ranch would be hers, and the solitude would be hers, and the years would come and go, and that would be the shape of things. She had been wrong about that. She was glad.